All right, good morning. Everybody's still kind of walking in, but if you would be turning to 2 Kings chapter 20. That's where we're going to start this morning. 2 Kings chapter 20. For those of you who are members at BCS, yes, I do own a suit. And no, you should not get used to it. Our topic this morning is Hezekiah's tunnel. We're only going to have a few slides. We'll use that for when we need pictures, but I'll leave it up there for now. We're going to read about Hezekiah's tunnel here in 2 Kings 20. So let's start reading in verses 20 and 21. 2 Kings 20, verses 20 and 21. And the rest of the acts of Hezekiah and all his might, how he made a pool and a conduit and brought water into the city, are they not written in the book of the Chronicles of the kings of Judah? And Hezekiah slept with his fathers, and Manasseh his son reigned in his stead. So we read here that King Hezekiah made a conduit. The New King James is going to translate that as tunnel. And he brought water into the city. So this morning we want to ask the question, who cares? Why is it so important that Hezekiah built this tunnel? And really, why is this tunnel such a big deal that it's listed here at his death as one of his biggest lifetime accomplishments? What did Hezekiah know that we don't know? If we're going to make sense of this tunnel Hezekiah made, to understand why he made it and why it's important, we're going to need to back way up. We're going to need to examine the story of the Israelites up to the point of its construction, and we're going to need to approach it from one particular perspective, one specific layer of understanding. So let's go to Exodus chapter 3. Now in Exodus chapter 3, Moses has come to Mount Horeb, the mountain of God, and God speaks to Moses out of the burning bush. And God has good news for Moses. He has seen the dire situation of the Israelites in Egyptian captivity, and he's going to do something about it. So let's start reading in verse 6. Exodus 3, verse 6. Moreover, he said, I am the God of thy father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. And Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look upon God. And the Lord said, I have surely seen the affliction of my people which are in Egypt, and have heard their cry by reason of their taskmasters, for I know their sorrows. And I am come down to deliver them out of the hand of the Egyptians, and to bring them up out of that land unto a good land and a large, unto a land flowing with milk and honey, unto the place of the Canaanites, and the Hittites, and the Amorites, and the Perizzites, and the Hivites, and the Jebusites. So we've got a few interesting things going on in these verses. First of all, God promises the Israelites that he's going to lead them out of Egypt and into the promised land. We also learn a few things here about this promised land. It's a good land. Some translations are going to say a fertile land. So it's good for crops. It's good for livestock. It's a large land. There's going to be plenty of space for the Israelite tribes to spread out and to grow their population. It's flowing with milk and honey. That is to say, it's a prosperous land with plenty of resources. The Israelites are not going to just be scraping by in this place. They're going to be able to grow wealthy and comfortable here. Everything God says about this new land is really enticing. Sounds good. It's a good place to live. They can prosper there, support their families, have physical security. Great. But we also learn something else about this promised land, and this thing is going to be the biggest problem about it. People already live there. God mentions 6 groups of people here who already occupy this land. And if this is such a good place to live, if it really is a land of milk and honey, these people are not going to want to leave. They're going to have to be removed by force. These opposing qualities of the Canaan land, you have agricultural richness on one hand, and you have the hostility and strength of its population on the other. These things are going to keep popping up throughout the Old Testament story, and they're going to be reflected in the way that the Israelites interact with the Promised Land for centuries. Let's go to Numbers 13. When we get to Numbers 13, at this point in the story, the Israelites have escaped Egypt, and they are getting ready to enter the Promised Land. As we know, that's going to take a lot longer than it should have, but that's what they're getting ready for. Let's start reading in verse 1, Numbers 13, verse 1. And the Lord spake unto Moses, saying, Send thou men, that they may search the land of Canaan, which I give unto the children of Israel. Of every tribe of their fathers shall ye send a man, every one a ruler among them. Now down to verse 17. And Moses sent them to spy out the land of Canaan, and said unto them, Get you up this way southward, and go up into the mountain, and see the land, what it is, and the people that dwelleth therein, whether they be strong or weak, few or many, and what the land is that they dwell in, whether it be good or bad, and what cities they be that they dwell in, whether in tents or in strongholds, and what the land is, whether it be fat or lean, whether there be wood therein or not. And be ye of good courage, and bring in the fruit of the land. Now the time was the time of the first ripe grapes. So in this chapter, we see that Moses has selected 12 men to spy out the land to perform what today we would call a reconnaissance mission in preparation for an invasion. These spies are sent into the Canaan land. They're going to come back and give their report. So down to verse 25. And they returned from searching of the land after 40 days. And they went and came to Moses and to Aaron and to all the congregation of the children of Israel unto the wilderness of Paran to Kadesh, and brought back word unto them and to all the congregation, and showed them the fruit of the land. And they told him and said, We came unto the land whither thou sentest us, and surely it floweth with milk and honey, and this is the fruit of it. Nevertheless, the people be strong that dwell in the land, and the cities are walled and very great. And moreover, we saw the children of Anak there. The Amalekites dwell in the land of the south, and the Hittites and the Jebusites and the Amorites dwell in the mountains. And the Canaanites dwell by the sea, by the coast of Jordan. And Caleb stilled the people before Moses and said, Let us go up at once and possess it, for we are well able to overcome it. But the men that went up with him said, We be not able to go up against the people, for they are stronger than we. And they brought up an evil report of the land, which they had searched unto the children of Israel, saying, The land, through which we have gone to search it, is a land that eateth up the inhabitants thereof, and all the people that we saw in it are men of a great stature. And there we saw the giants, the sons of Anak, which come of the giants, and we were in our own sight as grasshoppers, and so we were in their sight. So we get a divided report. We have 10 spies who say, yeah, the land's good, but the people are really strong. The cities are walled, they're fortified. I mean, there's literally giants over there. There's no way we can beat these guys. Caleb's got a different evaluation. And in chapter 14, we're going to see that Joshua agreed with him. They say, let's go. We're going to be able to conquer these people and win these battles. So two very different attitudes from the two groups of spies who went on the same mission. So let's step back for a minute and ask a question. Obviously, the 10 spies who were scared of what they saw in the promised land did not have sufficient faith in the power of God, and that was obviously wrong. They had a sinful attitude. They should have had more faith. That is without question. However, that is not what I want us to ask. The question I want us to ask is, was their evaluation wrong? I don't mean spiritually wrong. It obviously was. I mean factually wrong, physically incorrect. Was any piece of the report from the 10 spies factually incorrect? The answer is no. And for proof of this, let's go to Deuteronomy chapter 9. Deuteronomy chapter 9. Now here in Deuteronomy 9, we're going to have Moses speaking. So let's read verses 1 and 2. Deuteronomy 9, verses 1 and 2. Hear, O Israel, thou art to pass over Jordan this day, to go and to possess nations greater and mightier than thyself, cities great and fenced up to heaven, a people great and tall, the children of the Anakims, whom thou knowest, and of whom thou hast heard say, Who can stand before the children of Anak? Now this sounds a lot like the evil report from the 10 spies. He says these other nations really are greater and mightier than the Israelites. Their cities really are hard to attack. There really are big, tall, scary dudes living over there. He is confirming everything they said from a factual perspective. And we're going to look at some more of this in some more detail later. But let's keep reading. Let's read verse 3. Understand therefore this day that the Lord thy God is he which goeth over before thee. As a consuming fire he shall destroy them. He shall bring them down before thy face. So shalt thou drive them out and destroy them quickly, as the Lord hath said unto thee. So he agrees, yes, Canaan is a scary place full of big scary guys, but because of Jehovah's power, we're going to be successful. We are going to conquer the Canaan land. So on the one hand, we have this strictly physical assessment of the situation, the military assessment, we might say. And on the other hand, we have the spiritual assessment, this assessment that acknowledges the power of Jehovah in what's going on. One is more important than the other, obviously, but both have some elements of truth to them, and both are necessary to understand different aspects of our story. So what's the point of all this? How does this help us tell the story of Hezekiah's tunnel? If we're going to investigate the importance of Hezekiah's tunnel, we have to decide what framework, what layer of understanding makes the most sense, which is most applicable. When you consider the story of the Israelites that we find in the Old Testament, the exodus from Egypt, the invasion of the Canaan land, there are multiple different ways that we can approach the discussion. Obviously, the spiritual is the most important in any biblical discussion. For our lesson today, I'm going to assert that the best way to understand the importance of Hezekiah's tunnel is through a military lens. Hezekiah's tunnel is an infrastructure project. It is a national defense project. It is a response to a military threat. Now, we're going to talk about spiritual application along the way, don't get me wrong. But this study is best understood from a military perspective, and that's where we're going to focus most of our time. All right, so we're going to talk about the Canaan invasion, the Canaan campaign from a military perspective. If you're going to invade anywhere, you first need to figure out what are the particular challenges that you're going to have to solve. The Israelites have already identified some of these, and we've alluded to them. But let's take a deeper dive into exactly what the Israelites are going to have to overcome to pull this thing off. There are 4 basic challenges that they will have to overcome to conquer the Promised Land. Let's go to Joshua 17. Joshua 17, and we'll read verse 18. But the mountain shall be thine, for it is a wood, and thou shalt cut it down. And the outgoings of it shall be thine, for thou shalt drive out the Canaanites, though they have iron chariots, and though they be strong. So challenge number 1. The Canaanite people are a strong, well-armed, well-prepared people. They've got good weapons, they've got good technology, and they know how to use them. We've already mentioned there's a lot of big, tall, strong guys there. They're going to be a tough opponent. So that's challenge number 1. Now Joshua chapter 12. Joshua chapter 12. We'll read verses 7 and 8. And these are the kings of the country which Joshua and the children of Israel smote on this side Jordan on the west, from Baalgad in the valley of Lebanon, even unto the Mount Halak, that goeth up to Seir, which Joshua gave unto the tribes of Israel for a possession according to their divisions. In the mountains, and in the valleys, and in the plains, and in the springs, and in the wilderness, and in the south country, the Hittites, the Amorites, and the Canaanites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites. So challenge number 2. Difficult terrain, varied terrain. We see here listed valleys, mountains, plains, wilderness. Each of these is going to require different tactics and different preparation for a successful military operation. Chapter 10. Let's go to chapter 10. And let's read verse 5. Chapter 10, verse 5. Therefore the 5 kings of the Amorites, the king of Jerusalem, the king of Hebron, the king of Jarmuth, the king of Lachish, the king of Eglon, gathered themselves together, and went up, they and all their hosts, and encamped before Gibeon, and made war against it. Then I'll just read chapter 11, verse 5. And when all these kings were met together, they came and pitched together at the waters of Merom to fight against Israel. So, challenge number 3. Multiple established enemies and alliances. They're not just fighting one enemy, they're fighting a bunch of enemies. And these enemies are going to work together to slow the Israelite advance. Now, chapter 14. Joshua chapter 14. In chapter 14, we'll read verse 12. Now therefore give me this mountain, whereof the Lord spake in that day. For thou heardest in that day how the Anakims were there, and that the cities were great and fenced. If so be the Lord will be with me, that I shall be able, then I shall be able to drive them out, as the Lord said. So, challenge number 4, well-fortified defenses. As we've already read, the cities of the Promised Land were walled, fenced, well-defended against attackers. Jericho would be probably one of the most famous examples of one of these walled, well-defended cities. All right, so our 4 challenges. Well-armed and well-prepared opponents, difficult varied terrain, multiple established enemies and alliances, and well-fortified defenses and positions. The Promised Land is not going to be easy to conquer. So how did the Israelites deal with these challenges? Overall, we know that this campaign is going to be generally a success. The Israelites are going to become the dominant group in the area. But in reality, the campaign is going to be a bit of a mixed bag. The Israelites are going to have some successes and some failures. So let's look at a couple examples of each. Let's go to Joshua chapter 10. So in Joshua chapter 10, let's read first verse 16. But these 5 kings fled and hid themselves in a cave at Makkedah, down to verse 26. And afterward Joshua smote them and slew them and hanged them on 5 trees, and they were hanging upon the trees until the evening. So the Israelites successfully defeat the alliance of 5 kings at Makkedah. This is a great victory, a great success. Take out 5 enemies at once. Great. Let's look in chapter 8, Joshua chapter 8. And again, there's more detail to a lot of these battles and things that you can read on your own time, but we're just kind of getting the idea of what happened. Joshua chapter 8, verse 21. And when Joshua and all Israel saw that the ambush had taken the city, and that the smoke of the city ascended, then they turned again and slew the men of Ai. The ambush at Ai is one of the most famous of all of Joshua's victories. It was decisive. It helped set the tone for what came later. We could talk about other victories. Jericho, for example. There's more. So we see the Israelites had a lot of military success. They were a formidable fighting group, and they would have inspired fear in their opponents. But they did not achieve total victory in every place. They were not undefeated. Let's go to chapter 17. Joshua 17. And here's where we start to see the problem. And again, we're getting to Hezekiah's tunnel, but we're getting there. Joshua 17, starting in verse 11. And Manasseh had in Issachar and in Asher, Bethshean and her towns, and Ibleam and her towns, and the inhabitants of Dor and her towns, and the inhabitants of Endor and her towns, the inhabitants of Tanakh and her towns, and the inhabitants of Megiddo and her towns, even 3 countries. Yet the children of Manasseh could not drive out the inhabitants of those cities, but the Canaanites would dwell in that land. Yet it came to pass, when the children of Israel were waxen strong, that they put the Canaanites to tribute, but did not utterly drive them out. So the scripture lists 6 cities here and says that Manasseh was not able to drive the inhabitants of these places out. Verse 13 says they were strong, but they did not drive them out. Instead, they put them to tribute. This is kind of a victory, but not a complete one. And this kind of partial victory is going to be a problem. Remember Numbers 33:55. But if you do not drive the inhabitants of the land from before you, then it shall be that those whom you let remain shall be irritants in your eyes and thorns in your sides, and they shall harass you in the land where you dwell. So leaving inhabitants in the land like this is not what God intended. And these remaining opponents are going to be a problem if they are not dealt with. Let's go down to chapter 15 of Joshua chapter 15, because we're going to read about another group of people that's not going to be wiped out. And this is the one we care about the most for our study of Hezekiah's tunnel. Joshua chapter 15. And let's read verse 63. Joshua 15, verse 63. As for the Jebusites, the inhabitants of Jerusalem, the children of Judah could not drive them out. But the Jebusites dwell with the children of Judah at Jerusalem unto this day. Now, we've seen the Jebusites mentioned a few times already. They were all the way back in Exodus 3 as one of the groups that the Israelites were going to have to go up against. The scripture here says that the tribe of Judah was unable to conquer the city of Jerusalem, and the inhabitants of that city, the Jebusites, were not wiped out from the land. This is one of their biggest failures. Now, why is this? If the Israelites failed to take a city, clearly there's some kind of spiritual deficiency on their part. That's obvious, because we know that God said they'd be able to do it. There's something wrong spiritually. There's some lack of faith. There's something going on there. But from a military perspective, their failure is almost certainly from one of our 4 challenges, or maybe a combination of them. The reason they didn't conquer Jerusalem is probably either weapons, terrain, alliances, or fortifications, or some combination of those 4. Let's go to Joshua 11, because one of these 4 is going to be pretty obvious. Joshua 11, and we'll read verse 3. Joshua 11, verse 3. And to the Canaanite on the east and on the west, and to the Amorite, and the Hittite, and the Perizzite, and the Jebusite in the mountains, and to the Hivite under Hermon in the land of Mizpah. So the Jebusites lived in the mountains. So one problem is our second challenge, difficult terrain. Look here at this rendering of Jerusalem roughly in the time of David. So what do you notice about it? It's on a hill. It's on a hill. It's elevated. The terrain makes it easily defensible. The whole reason Jerusalem is a desirable location is because it's on a hill and it's difficult to attack. Now, as we know, David is eventually going to take this city and make it his capital. Let's go to 2 Samuel chapter 5. 2 Samuel chapter 5. We'll start reading in verse 6. And the king and his men went to Jerusalem unto the Jebusites, the inhabitants of the land, which spake unto David, saying, Except thou take away the blind and the lame, thou shalt not come in hither, thinking, David cannot come in hither. Nevertheless, David took the stronghold of Zion, the same as the city of David. And David said on that day, Whosoever getteth up to the gutter, and smiteth the Jebusites, and the lame and the blind that are hated of David's soul, he shall be chief and captain. Wherefore they said, The blind and the lame shall not come into the house. So David dwelt in the fort, and called it the city of David. And David built round about from Milo and inward. So David eventually does it. He takes over Jerusalem, and he makes it his city. We should understand by now why he wanted it. Not only is it bad to have a Jebusite city as a thorn in the middle of your territory, he wanted it because it's a great spot. Again, the entire point of possessing Jerusalem is that it's on a mountain and it is easily defended. But notice something interesting here about how David was finally able to conquer this city. How did he get in? The King James says through the gutter. The New King James is a little more specific here, so let's 2 Samuel 5, verse 8 in the New King James. Now David said on that day, Whoever climbs up by way of the water shaft and defeats the Jebusites, the lame and the blind, who are hated by David's soul, he shall be chief and captain. Therefore they say, The blind and the lame shall not come into the house. So how'd they get into the city? Through the water shaft. The New American Standard says, through the water tunnel. See, Jerusalem's a great city. It's a great place to make your capital. It's on a hill, great, but it has a weakness. And it's a weakness that David was able to exploit to his advantage, a weakness that allowed it to be conquered. We don't have all the detail about this weakness here in this passage, but we do know that it had something to do with the water supply. So let's summarize. The Israelites were generally successful in their invasion of the Canaan land. They overcame a lot of obstacles along the way. But there were a few places they failed to take, at first at least, the most famous of those being Jerusalem. Jerusalem was defendable because of its terrain and fortifications, but it had some kind of exploitable weakness related to its water supply. So we're now finally ready to talk about Hezekiah's tunnel. First of all, when did Hezekiah build this tunnel? Hezekiah ruled from around 715 BC to around 686 BC, plus or minus a little bit. Again, you can be a year or two here or there in those and still be generally right. So for a round number, it's not wrong to say his tunnel was built around 700 BC. If you need a round number to remember, 700 BC. We already read in 2 Kings that he built a conduit, but if we go to 2 Chronicles, we get a little more detail. So let's go to 2 Chronicles 32. 2 Chronicles 32. And we'll read verse 30. 2 Chronicles 32, verse 30. This same Hezekiah also stopped the upper watercourse of Gihon, and brought it straight down to the west side of the city of David. And Hezekiah prospered in all his works. So here's a name that we haven't talked about yet this morning, Gihon. What is Gihon? It refers to the Gihon Spring, as you can see up here on the map, there on the right. And the Gihon Spring is the place that ties everything we've been talking about together. We mentioned that Jerusalem's water supply is a problem, that David was able to exploit it as a weakness, and here's why. Look at this visual. The Gihon Spring is Jerusalem's primary source of fresh water. And what do you notice about where it is? It is not on top of the mountain. It's on the side of the mountain facing the Kidron Valley. And this is a problem. This is a big problem, a potentially fatal problem. This is the glaring strategic weakness of the city of Jerusalem. If you build a wall around the top of the mountain, okay, great. Your population is safe and successfully defended inside, but now your water source is outside the wall. Who else is outside the wall? The enemy is outside the wall. Now they're out there with the water, and you're in here dying of thirst. Multiple kings and rulers before Hezekiah had tried to deal with this. If you notice here in this representation, it's a little more artistic, but you'll notice down here, these little things right here, this is representing fortifications that were built around the Gihon Spring. Everybody who, the Jebusites knew this was a problem, the kings of Israel and Judah knew this was a problem, and archaeology has shown that there were multiple defenses, multiple water diversion projects and other structures that were built over the centuries to try to protect the spring from invaders and from outside threats. And when we get to 2 Kings, King Hezekiah is going to have to deal with a major threat of his own, and that threat's name is Sennacherib. Let's go to 2 Kings chapter 18. 2 Kings chapter 18. Now in the 14th year of King Hezekiah did Sennacherib, king of Assyria, come up against all the fenced cities of Judah and took them. So now our roles have been reversed. In the book of Joshua, the Israelites were the invaders, but now in 2 Kings, they're the defenders. So let's think back to all the things we've studied so far today, because the reason we've talked about all this background info is that Hezekiah knew every last one of these things. All we've done so far in our lesson today has been just catching us up to the body of knowledge that he used to make his decisions. So Hezekiah knew the history of the Canaan invasion. He knew the history of Jerusalem. He knew how defensible it was, given the right conditions. He knew how difficult the terrain would make it for any advancing army, because the Israelites were unsuccessful the first time around. He knew that fortifications were going to be important. Verse 13 here says he had built fenced cities. The problem is they weren't good enough. They didn't slow Sennacherib down at all. Sennacherib's coming to Jerusalem. Hezekiah remembers that David took Jerusalem by attacking through the water tunnel. The reason David was able to take Jerusalem from the Jebusites in the first place was because the Jebusites failed to properly protect their water supply. So this time, Hezekiah decides to do something about it. Let's go to 2 Chronicles 32. 2 Chronicles 32. We're going to start reading in verse 1. 2 Chronicles 32, verse 1. After these things, and the establishment thereof, Sennacherib king of Assyria came, and entered into Judah, and encamped against the fenced cities, and thought to win them for himself. And when Hezekiah saw that Sennacherib was come, and that he was purposed to fight against Jerusalem, he took counsel with his princes and his mighty men to stop the waters of the fountains which were without the city, and they did help him. So there was gathered much people together, who stopped all the fountains and the brook that ran through the midst of the land, saying, Why should the kings of Assyria come and find much water? Also he strengthened himself, and built up all the wall that was broken, and raised it up to the towers, and another wall without, and repaired Milo in the city of David, and made darts and shields in abundance. So, in response to this pending threat, Hezekiah starts a major project to protect Judah's water sources from the invading army. He wants to keep the water accessible to his people and deny access to Sennacherib's people. They stop the springs, they redirect the brooks as part of the military preparations for the coming siege. Hezekiah's tunnel is part of this project. So you'll see here on your left, here's a map of the tunnel itself. It's about 1,750 feet long. As you can see from this picture on the right, that's not Tom, but it could be. It is tall enough to walk through. It's about a foot higher at one end than the other, so water is going to slowly flow downward. And it starts at the Gihon Spring, as you can see here on the left, your left. And it ends at the pool of Siloam. And yes, it is that same pool of Siloam from John 9. That's what Hezekiah's tunnel empties into. And for that reason, you will sometimes see the tunnel called the Newer Siloam Tunnel. It was not the world's best engineering job. We'll talk about that more in a minute when we get to some of the inscriptions that were found there. But notice what Hezekiah has done here. This tunnel diverts the residual overflow from the Gihon Spring. Instead of it flowing out into the Kidron Valley, it now goes to the pool of Siloam inside the city walls. This secures water for the people inside the city and denies it to the people outside the city. That's it. That's the whole answer. Invading army, move the water from outside to inside. That's the whole story. It's that simple, and that's why he built the tunnel. No more water outside, more water inside. That's it. Now, let's talk about the tunnel in present day just a little bit. The first kind of modern person to talk about this tunnel was an Italian guy named Franciscus Quaresimus, I think that's right, in 1625. He toured the area, he wrote about the tunnel, and he did describe it in some detail, but he didn't seem to put two and two together that it was Hezekiah's tunnel. You really start to have an archaeological record in around 1828. There was a guy from Connecticut named Edward Robinson, and he toured the Holy Land and wrote about the tunnel, but again, didn't really make the connection to Hezekiah. In 1871, a guy named Charles Warren realized, hey, this tunnel might be Hezekiah's tunnel. It kind of fits a lot of the criteria. Then in 1884, there was a guy named Jacob Elihu, and he found this. This is called the Siloam inscription, and was found about 20 feet in from one of the entrances. It's written in Hebrew. It's written in an 8th century BC writing style, which matches our time period exactly, remember 700 BC. And this is in a museum in Istanbul now, which makes the Israelis about as happy as you would expect. But obviously I can't read this, so let's look at what the translation is. The translation of the inscription. This is the story of the tunnel while the axes were against each other, and while 3 cubits were left to cut, the voice of a man called to his counterpart, for there was excess in the rock on the right. And on the day of the tunnel being finished, the stonecutters struck each man toward his counterpart, axe against axe, and flowed water from the source to the pool for 1,200 cubits. And 100 cubits was the height over the head of the stonecutters. So this tells us a little bit about the construction process. They started at either end, and they had 2 teams that were going like this. And they connected the 2 halves when they got in the middle. If you look back at the map, you can see where they met is pointed out there, and you kind of see what the path does. You go like this, and then you go like that. So if you think about what this translation is saying, it's saying, well, they got to where they thought they were done, and then you have a guy yelling, "Hey, we're over here." And you have another guy over here yelling, "Hey, we're over here." And they're like, "Cut that away." And so then you get back here, and they're like, "Oh, they're that way." Make the connection right there. So again, not the most precision engineering or planning, but it got the job done. They got it done. So now we know what Hezekiah's tunnel is. We know why he built it. We know that it really does exist. And, as was mentioned, you can go see it today. I haven't been. I'd like to. I'm not going to go right now. It's a little bit dangerous. But it really does exist, and you can go see it. From an evidences perspective, obviously, the archaeology matches the scripture. That should not surprise us. The location, the time period, the purpose, everything. The story of Hezekiah's tunnel is not the kind of thing that's going to convert a person by itself. But if you are building your own arsenal of Bible evidences, and you should be, you can add this one to your list, and you can use it in the right situation to further strengthen your arguments for the inerrancy of the Scripture. Now for some spiritual application and then some final thoughts. First of all, Hezekiah's tunnel was part of God's providence for his people. Let's read in Romans 13. I think this is a passage that most of us know, but I think it really applies here. Romans 13, starting in verse 1. Let every soul be subject unto the higher powers, for there is no power but of God. The powers that be are ordained of God. Whosoever therefore resisteth the power, resisteth the ordinance of God, and they that resist shall receive to themselves damnation. For rulers are not a terror to good works, but to the evil. Wilt thou then not be afraid of the power? Do that which is good, and thou shalt have praise of the same. For he is the minister of God to thee for good. But if thou do that which is evil, be afraid, for he beareth not the sword in vain. For he is the minister of God, a revenger to execute wrath upon him that doeth evil. Let's imagine that we're an average Israelite, just regular Israelite going around our ordinary business, and we know, here comes Sennacherib. From that perspective, Hezekiah building this tunnel was the providence of God, and it was the act of a good ruler. He was ministering to the good. He was ministering to their safety, their security, and their general well-being. We need to give God credit for this. It may be Hezekiah's tunnel, but who made Hezekiah king? God made Hezekiah king. So really, it's God's tunnel. Second of all, Hezekiah correctly identified their weaknesses. Proverbs 14:8 says, "The wisdom of the prudent is to understand his way, but the folly of fools is deceit." Hezekiah did not deceive himself about the situation. He did not act like there was not a problem. He did not act like everything would be fine if he ignored the threat. He recognized that the city had a weakness, and he addressed it. He didn't say something like, Sennacherib, that guy ain't nothing. He may have fought all these other guys and beat him, but he hadn't fought us yet. We'll get him. No, he knew he was in trouble, and he did something about it. 2 Corinthians 13:5 comes to mind here. Examine yourselves whether ye be in the faith. Prove your own selves. We have to be able to look at our own spiritual weaknesses impartially and accurately if we're going to ensure we will be pleasing to God. And tied to all of this, it's undeniable that Hezekiah was a doer. Again, remember James 1:22. But be ye doers of the word and not hearers only. Hezekiah knew what to do to save his people, and he did it. He heard about the threat. He acted on it. Now, you could do more here, obviously. There's a lot we could talk about this. Preachers, if you're looking for a sermon idea about Hezekiah's tunnel, maybe something like the king brought the water of life inside the city, that might be a free one. Take that idea and run with it a bit. So I won't charge extra for that one. So as we start to wrap up here, I want to address a common objection, I guess is the way to put it, about this kind of study, and really with the study of history in general. If you don't know me, I work in business and technology for a living, but my academic training is as a historian and a journalist. Trent mentioned the other day that he didn't like history growing up, and believe me, I get it. I get it. In general, I think if you feel that way, it was probably, your teachers did you wrong, is probably the way it was. But it is common when we're talking about topics like this, about historical topics like this, to hear objections like, why should I study this? What does this have to do with me? Spiritual application aside, what does this have to do with me? And as a historian, it pains me to hear that question because I believe that you cannot escape the past until you are aware of how it influences you. Understanding the past is the best means that we have of gaining control over the past. And that's true on a macro level, on a country level, like Hezekiah did it, and it's true on a personal level. I encourage you to study your country's past, to study your family's past, to study the church's past, because you may be surprised at the choices that have been made for your life without your knowledge and without your consent. Learn the past and gain control. Study the past and gain free will. Gain back power over your life from those who came before you. There is no independence, national or individual, without the study of the past. Hezekiah clearly believed in this. He believed in the power of historical study. He used what he knew about the history of his city and his country to change its fortunes, to free himself and his people from being slaves to previous outcomes. He said, we're not going to be conquered like the Jebusites were. We're going to do something about it. And this is what we can do too. We can free ourselves from the mistakes of our forebears. But again, what does this have to do with me? Let's conclude by getting specific about our particular topic today. Let's get specific with some historical application about the Gihon Spring itself. Because when we ask, what does the study of history have to do with me? We need to understand that some things really do never change. Now, I alluded to the fact that I'm not going to go visit this tunnel right now. I think we know why that is. We know that the land of Israel is consumed in violence today. It has basically been consumed in violence, however long you go back. The current conflict is complicated. I'm not going to try to list the reasons for it. I'm not qualified to do that. But a lot of the situation stems from the creation of the modern state of Israel, and this happened as a direct result of World War II and some other sociological forces that were going on. In 1948, the state of Israel gained its independence from the British Empire. Immediately after they declared independence, immediately, like the next morning, the surrounding Arab nations invaded. The Israelis knew that this invasion was coming. They could look, it's like, the Egyptians, the Jordanians, they've all got their tanks right on our border. Here they come. And the Israelis knew, based on their study of history, based on their study of geography, they knew that controlling the water supply was going to be a key part of repelling the invaders and keeping the territory they had conquered from the Palestinians. In 2022, so just a couple of years ago, we have some recent information on this. A couple of historians named Morris and Kedar examined some previously classified and unknown documents. Morris and Kedar uncovered the existence of a secret Israeli Special Forces operation from 1948 called Operation Cast Thy Bread. In Operation Cast Thy Bread, the Israelis systematically resorted to biological warfare to make it as difficult as possible for Palestinians to live in areas the Israelis did not want them in. They did this by attacking the water supply, and their targets included the Gihon Spring. In April 1948, Israeli Special Forces secretly introduced typhus and diphtheria bacteria into multiple water sources, including the Gihon Spring, with the intended goal of preventing Palestinians from living in the area. Now, it is outside the scope of our lesson this morning to evaluate the morality of specific decisions and tactics used in the heat of warfare. You can do that on your own time, but the fact remains, and this is what the Israelis did. Now, it's often said that history repeats itself. This is not precisely true, and Hezekiah is proof of that. Circumstances are never identical. The people in charge aren't the same kind of people. Personalities are different. The people around you are different. The threats are different. The countries that might be attacking you are different. Priorities are different. People's values change over time. We've seen that. But we study history because many things do stay the same. Geography, economics, human feelings, human motivations, these things were the same in Bible times as they are today. We see the proof of this in the similarities that happen across the ages, and the story of the land of Israel is no different. In 700 BC, when the Israelites saw an invading force approaching, they denied their enemies access to the water supply. They diverted the Gihon Spring. In 1948, when the Israelis saw an invading force approaching, they denied their enemies access to the water supply. They poisoned the Gihon Spring.